It was a hot and sunny afternoon in Salvador. The atmosphere was filled with excitement and anticipation, as tangible as the smell of acarage wafting through the market outside. Marcos and Leticia were at home, organizing the last few things for the trip. In the center of the living room, the family's suitcase was open, overflowing with clothes and documents. Tiago and Beatriz, their 10 and 6-year-old children, were helping as best they could, but their gazes betrayed a mix of curiosity and anxiety. It was the big farewell to everything they had ever known. Marcos, a civil engineer, and Leticia, a history teacher, had always dreamed of providing their children with a better life, away from the limitations and hardships they often faced due to racism. Although they had built solid careers in Brazil, the search for new opportunities for their children's life and education had become a necessity. The chance to live in a foreign country, where they could start over and pursue a future without so many barriers, seemed like the realization of a long-held dream. "Is everything ready, love?" Leticia asked, holding one of the plane tickets in her hand. Her smile was shy, as if she wasn't sure whether happiness had already arrived or if they were still on the way. "Yes, everything's ready," Marcos replied, his gaze distant. He was excited, but also uneasy. The farewell was a weight he couldn't shake off. I don't know if I'm really ready for this," he confessed, more to himself than to Leticia. She placed her hand on his shoulder, as if trying to convey calm. "We're strong, Marcos. We've been through so much together. Now it's our moment. We'll create a new future for them." Tiago and Beatriz were sitting on the couch, listening intently to their parents' conversation. Tiago, the older one, was starting to understand the gravity of the change. He knew he was leaving behind his friends, his school, and even the food he loved so much. Beatriz, younger, didn't yet understand what it meant to leave Brazil, but her curiosity was evident. "Mom, I'm going to miss Grandma," Beatriz said, tugging at her mother's hand. Leticia smiled warmly. "I know, sweetie. Grandma will miss us too, but we'll visit her, I promise." As the family talked about the days ahead, Marcos looked out the window. The image of the city, with its contrasts, the cobblestone streets, the simple houses, and the concrete buildings, seemed to tell him a story of resilience. He remembered how many times in his professional journey he had to fight against subtle prejudice, against doors that closed just because he was Black. But this was the time to start over, to rewrite his story, and he knew it. That evening, after dinner, the family gathered for one last moment together. Marcos had prepared a small meal with all their favorite foods, and they sat at the table, talking about what awaited them in their new destination. The conversation flowed naturally, but there was something melancholic in the air. They all knew this was the last family meal before the big change. "When we get there, everything's going to be different, isn't it?" Tiago asked, with a thoughtful expression. "It will be, son," Leticia replied, stroking his hair. "But we'll be together, and together we can face anything." A brief silence followed, as everyone reflected on their mother's words. It was the beginning of a new phase, but, at the same time, a painful farewell to everything they loved and knew. They were ready to fly, to leave behind the limitations that Brazil imposed on them, but with heavy hearts for the things they couldn't carry with them. The Brazil they loved, with all its difficulties and charms, would be left behind. The next day, the airport awaited them. They knew the future was in their hands, but they also knew that the journey was just beginning. The flight symbolized freedom, but the trip itself, they felt, had only just begun. The airport was crowded that morning. The sense of urgency was in the air, with passengers hurrying, children crying, and the loudspeakers echoing endless announcements. Marcos and Leticia were visibly nervous, but happy to be almost boarding for the start of their new life. Tiago and Beatriz, once again, were excited, but they couldn't help but feel the pressure of the environment around them. "Come on, everyone. It's almost time. Hurry up," Marcos said, trying to convey the feeling that everything was under control. He had always been the type of person who liked to stay calm, especially when his family needed him. Leticia followed right behind, holding Beatriz's hand, while Tiago carried his backpack, looking around with the curious eyes of someone about to embark on a big adventure. The check-in counter was ahead, and the line was long. They patiently took their place, and little by little, the anxiety was replaced by a sense of reality. They were about to board the plane, to cross the ocean. The new life felt so close. When it was finally their turn, the airline clerk, a middle-aged woman, smiled politely. "Good morning. Passports and documents, please." Marcos and Letitia quickly handed everything over. The clerk looked over the tickets, then glanced at the documents. At first, everything seemed normal, but after a few seconds, the woman began to inspect the papers more closely, and her smile slowly faded. "Sir, could you please show me the children's documents again?" The clerk's voice was colder now, and she seemed to be making an effort to hide her discomfort. Marcos, a bit confused, handed over the children's passports again, along with their birth certificates. "Here they are, everything's in order," he replied, trying to stay calm. But the clerk didn't seem convinced. "I need you to show me another form of identification, proof of address, anything that can help confirm their identity." Letitia, now sensing the strange tone of the conversation, asked, "But we've already shown everything that was requested. Everything is within the rules." The clerk remained silent for a few moments, looking at the documents more carefully, as if searching for something. She then raised her eyes and, with an expression that was now visibly uncomfortable, looked at Marcos and Letitia. "I need to confirm a few things." "Just a moment, please," she said, stepping away to talk to someone else. Tension began to rise. Marcos and Letitia exchanged looks, sensing something strange in the air. There was a growing discomfort, something that seemed to go beyond a simple document check. With each passing minute, the pressure mounted. Tiago was beginning to realize that something wasn't right. He looked at his parents, worried. Beatriz, more innocent, held Letitia's hand tightly, not understanding what was going on. "Why is it taking so long?" Tiago asked, his voice already tinged with unease. Marcos tried to calm him, but he was also restless. "It's probably just a normal check. Nothing to worry about, son. Let's wait." But instead of a simple confirmation, what came next was far more unsettling. After a few minutes, a security guard approached. He was tall, wearing a dark uniform, and had an impassive expression. "Sir, may I speak with you for a moment?" he said, addressing Marcos directly. The discomfort in the air engulfed the family. Marcos, still trying to stay calm, responded with a forced smile. "Of course, what's going on?" The security guard looked at the clerk, who subtly shook her head. "We're verifying some inconsistencies with your documents. We need you to wait for a moment while we sort this out." Marcos was confused. "Inconsistencies? But all the documents are correct. We have the tickets, the passports, the birth certificates. There's nothing wrong." The security guard didn't seem to care about the explanations. "I just need to confirm a few things. Please wait." The atmosphere grew even more tense. Other passengers began to notice what was happening and started to discreetly glance at the family, some whispering. Letitia felt her heart race. She knew something wasn't right. There was something in the way people were looking at them and the posture of the staff that felt uncomfortable. They were being treated differently. "Why are they doing this to us?" Letitia murmured to Marcos, her eyes brimming with tears. "Are they doing this because of how we look? They're not checking anyone else's documents."
Marcos didn't know what to say.
He, too, was beginning to realize that deep down this wasn't just a simple bureaucratic mistake. Something deeper was going on. He could feel the situation becoming uncomfortable in a way he didn't entirely understand, but that he could sense in his skin, in his history. The minutes that followed seemed to drag on. The security guard stayed next to the family, observing them with intense scrutiny. Other staff members began to approach, and the atmosphere became even heavier. The sense that they were being watched, distrusted, grew with each passing second. The tension became palpable. "I don't understand," Marcos thought, feeling the discomforting stares from other passengers. "Why is this happening?" The feeling of helplessness mixed with the anger that was starting to rise in his chest. Something was happening, something he couldn't control, but that he knew he shouldn't accept. Time seemed to stand still. Marcos and Letitia were there, standing at the counter, surrounded by the stares of other passengers and staff. The atmosphere of apprehension was almost palpable, and each second dragged on like an eternity. The security guard continued to watch them with a stern gaze, while the clerk seemed to hesitate, exchanging looks with her superiors. Tiago, the older one, was starting to get agitated. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he could tell his parents weren't happy. Beatriz, holding Letitia's hand, felt the discomfort in the air and, without fully understanding, squeezed her mother's hand tighter. "It's okay, son." Marcos tried to reassure Tiago, but his voice was tense, trembling. He was trying to believe his own words, but something inside him told him the situation was about to take a much more complicated turn. The security guard finally broke the silence, addressing Marcos directly in a firm voice, but with a condescending tone that made his heart race. "Sir, we'd like to ask you and your family to wait in the conference room. We need to resolve some pending issues." The word pending felt like a blow. They had no pending issues. They had all their documents in order, with properly issued tickets. But more than that, they knew this wasn't about bureaucracy. It was something much deeper, something related to the fact that they were a black family trying to board an international flight. Marcos didn't want to give in, but he knew any resistance there could make things worse. He took a deep breath and looked at Letitia. She watched him for a moment, her eyes reflecting the pain and disbelief, but there was no anger in them. Only emptiness, as if this moment were a repetition of so many others they had lived, but in a crueler way. "Let's go, love," Letitia whispered, guiding Beatriz by the hand. "Let's see what they want." They followed the security guard to the conference room, which was small, without windows, and had a single worn-out sofa in the corner. The air was heavy, and the sense of discomfort was overwhelming. Once inside, the security guard stepped away to speak with another employee, while the family stood there, unsure of what to do. "Why are they doing this to us?" Tiago finally asked, letting the pain and anger that had been building up inside him show. "We've got everything right. Everything's in order." Marcos looked at him, trying not to show the anguish he felt. "I know, son. I know everything is fine. We just need to wait a little longer." But in truth, Marcos knew this wasn't just a normal wait. They were being treated as if they were suspects, as if they didn't have the right to be there, as if they were less than the other passengers who were walking freely through the gates, without being questioned. Then, the door to the room opened again, and a supervisor entered. He was a middle-aged man, with an authoritative posture, and his presence immediately created an atmosphere of tension. He looked at the family with a vacant stare, showing no sign of sympathy or empathy. "Well, it seems we have some inconsistencies with this family's documents," he said in a nearly impersonal tone, looking at the sheet of paper in his hand. "We'd like to confirm your details again. This may take some time." Letitia swallowed hard. "There are no inconsistencies. Everything is correct. Please tell us what's going on." The supervisor merely shook his head, as if he were conducting some routine verification. "I understand, ma'am, but what we need now is a few more minutes to confirm the details. We won't let you board without resolving this." At that moment, Marcos felt a knot in his throat. Time was moving slowly, but the sense of helplessness had become unbearable. He knew what was happening, but he was trying to fight against the fear of being ignored, of being disrespected in an even more blatant way. Then, something changed in the atmosphere. Other passengers began to approach, one by one, and discreetly observe the scene. People were whispering to each other, exchanging curious looks. Some were clearly uncomfortable, others seemed uncertain, but no one was doing anything to intervene. And it was there, in that moment of public humiliation, that Tiago finally exploded. "Why is no one doing anything? They're lying. We haven't done anything wrong." The boy's words echoed in the room, and for a moment, everything fell silent. The supervisor and the security guard exchanged quick glances, as if the impact of Tiago's outburst had shaken their control of the situation. But what happened next was even more shocking. A woman in line, who had been waiting to be assisted at another counter, approached and said firmly, "I saw everything, and this isn't right. They're not doing anything wrong." It's clear they're being treated differently. The woman looked at the supervisor, and other passengers began to approach, murmuring words of support. There was a growing tension, but somehow, the solidarity of a few people began to give strength to the family. The fight was there, right before everyone's eyes, and those who were watching couldn't close their eyes to what was happening anymore. The supervisor seemed taken aback by the support the family was receiving, but he remained firm. "We'll resolve this internally," he said, and soon left with the security guard. The situation wasn't resolved yet, but in that moment, Marcos and Letitia felt something new, the realization that, perhaps, they weren't alone. That the fight for justice wasn't just in their hands, but that there were people willing to stand against the injustice they were experiencing. The supervisor and the security guard left the conference room, leaving the family alone. The silence that followed was heavy, dense, almost impossible to bear. The tension that had built up throughout the incident now seemed to have settled into the bodies of Marcos and Letitia, who were paralyzed, unsure of what to expect next. But, contrary to what many might imagine, there was no room for despair. When Tiago spoke, his eyes shining with anger and frustration, the family found something stronger than fear, an unshakable will to fight. Not only for the humiliation, but for the certainty that they were being wronged by something much bigger. "I'm not letting this go," Marcos said, his voice firm. He already felt the weight on his shoulders, the pressure of being black in a space where discrimination disguised itself as normal procedures. But he knew that for his children, he had to be an example of courage. "We're going all the way with this." Letitia, who had always been the calmer one, also felt a growing rage. She no longer wanted to allow her family to be treated with less respect than anyone else. "Marcos, we need proof. We can't just rely on what they say. We need to show the world what happened here." As the minutes dragged on, and time seemed to stand still, the supervisor returned to the room. He was visibly uncomfortable, trying to maintain a professional demeanor, but his nervousness was clear. "Sir and ma'am, I apologize for the delay," he began, but the coldness in his voice was undeniable. "We are reviewing your documents and can confirm that there are no irregularities. However, we would like to apologize for the inconvenience and the time lost." Marcos looked directly into the supervisor's eyes. "It's not just about the time lost. It's not just about the inconvenience. What happened here is much bigger. We're talking about discrimination. This can't be resolved with empty apologies." What could have been just a formality for resolving the issue turned into something much larger. It was an opportunity to not only denounce a procedural error, but also the institutional racism that had manifested so clearly. The supervisor hesitated, but Marcos didn't let him sidestep the conversation. "You can't just say sorry and think everything is fixed. This will not fade from our memory, and it shouldn't fade from yours. This kind of behavior cannot be tolerated in a public space like this. We are citizens. We paid for our tickets like anyone else. We are not criminals just because of the color of our skin." Letitia, sensing that the time for action had come, stepped forward and, with the same firmness, continued, "We are talking about a violation of our rights. A discriminatory treatment, not just by the supervisor, but also by the clerk and the security guard. They treated us as if we were criminals, without justification. This is unacceptable." The supervisor remained silent, his expression wavering between discomfort and frustration. He knew that what Marcos and Letitia were saying had merit. But no matter how hard he tried to stay composed, the pressure was mounting. It was when the woman who had approached them earlier, with her voice of support, entered the room again, accompanied by other passengers who had witnessed the entire scene. Some of them were visibly uncomfortable and now stood by the family's side. "I was here and saw everything," the woman said firmly. "The treatment given to this family was humiliating. And I'm not the only one who noticed. We all saw what happened, and there's no explanation for what they did to them. If this isn't resolved, we'll make a formal complaint." The supervisor looked around at the passengers, and the weight of the situation became undeniable. He knew he could no longer ignore the pressure. Marcos and Letitia's words were echoing, and the witnesses were stepping forward to support their cause. The risk of a bigger scandal was real, and the situation was spiraling out of control. Finally, the supervisor sighed, no longer knowing how to escape the pressure. "I will report the incident. You and your family are right. We apologize, and I will make sure an internal investigation is conducted." Marcos and Letitia exchanged a look of relief. It wasn't an immediate solution, but it was a first step toward something bigger. Something that could spark change. "This isn't just about us," Letitia said, still with a firm voice, but now with a touch of hope. "This is about everyone who's ever been humiliated like we were because of the color of their skin. And we're doing this for them too." The family was finally allowed to board, but the feeling of victory didn't come with just the permission to proceed with their flight. They knew that this moment would still serve as a milestone in the fight against discrimination. And as they walked toward the gate, Marcos felt the weight of injustice still on his shoulders, but it didn't break him. He felt strengthened, not by the defeat of those who tried to oppress them, but by the courage to stand up, to cry out for justice. When the plane took off, carrying them to a new chapter in their lives, they knew that the road ahead would be full of challenges. But they were more united than ever, with the certainty that when it comes to dignity and rights, no flight is high enough to silence their voice.